Good evening. My name is Alexander Hagan. I'm the CEO of a mid-sized tech company in Silicon Valley, and I want to speak to you tonight about the race between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. There are certain things that have occurred in Libya that are so disturbing, so heart-wrenching, and so criminal, so irresponsible, that for me it's impossible for any person to seriously vote for Hillary Clinton if they knew just how serious these problems are. And for those of you who consider voting for or flirting with Trump or Rubio or Cruz, Trump is too dangerous a man to entrust the elegance of the office of the presidency for. Mr. Cruz has said he would like to make the desert glow in the dark. He has conducted a very hardball campaign. He has suspicious and troubling financial connections, he and his wife, to Goldman Sachs. And Rubio trots out the same tired arguments of standard accelerate all the money to the top republicanism, that cutting regulations and reducing taxes will lead to a miracle, when all it's done in the last 30 years has brought more money up to the top, regardless of what your position is on the political spectrum about the division between government and the private sector. You must have the option to vote for Bernie Sanders in the general election, and I will prove this to you. Bernie Sanders this morning, speaking to Chuck Todd, was asked what he would have done differently in Libya. He said he would have been a little more patient. And that is a precisely correct, although extremely high-level answer. The problem, so I have researched this for thousands of hours. Briefly recount the events. The Arab Spring was kicked off in Tunisia by a market seller lighting himself on fire. And in fact, the only place that the Arab Spring has truly worked out at all is Tunisia, because there were mass uprising on the streets. Forget everything you've been told about Gaddafi. It's a long and complicated story. There was a revolution against a king in 1969, a king that was considered a Western puppet, where the vast majority of Libya's oil wealth did not get distributed. There was mass poverty, mass illiteracy. There was a young officer's revolution, bloodless revolution, and Gaddafi literally drove into the king's palace with a tank, and not a shot was fired, and a group of young officers proceeded to have a wonderfully popular revolution for about 6 years, where illiteracy was vanquished, poverty was vanquished, housing insecurity was vanquished, medical care was introduced. Then Gaddafi started to export his revolutionary fervor to help other revolutionary movements. He was considered the closest and best supporter to the African National Congress during the apartheid regime of white supremacist South Africa. Nelson Mandela was deeply upset about what happened to Libya. He also supported some characters that were a real mistake to support. But this is not specifically about making a case for or against Gaddafi, whether he's a hero or a criminal. It has more to do with our own conduct in botching everything up horribly. The worst atrocity they'd had in their past since the '69 revolution, where Gaddafi and his cohorts came to power, was a prison massacre in around 1993, sometime around there. 1,200, 1,500 people were massacred during a prison riot. The majority of these people were Islamists. They were Islamists the same sort that we would encounter in fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. They were extremist fanatics that wanted to impose a non-secular state. They wanted to have a Sharia type of state. They wanted women to cover up. In Libya, women, just as in Iraq, could be professors, could do whatever they wanted, could divorce. Monogamy was the law. One of the first acts of the new government was to repeal monogamy and replace it to allow men to marry multiple women, without the women being able to object. So it was the relatives of these people who the son of Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam, actually went through a reconciliation process with and released from prison the remaining 150 or so hardcore extremists in an internationally recognized process of trying to de-radicalize quote-unquote terrorists. It was the families of these sorts of people who were protesting, which was the breakout of the Libyan revolution. And in fact, in many cities it did spread, and people were tired of the Libyan soft dictatorship. Now, I've seen thousands of hours of newsreels about Libya, and I have determined that of all the people that I have listened to, probably the best person for you folks to bank on is this guy right here, Dr. Mabrouk Derbash, who supported the Libyan revolution in the beginning, and of course no real Libyan patriot could support what came in the end. There still needs to be a Libyan revolution. He says a second one is beginning, and it's good news, and we need to guide it. We should never forget the atrocities committed, the fact that it wasn't fair what we did to the sitting government of Libya, regardless of their faults, and what we brought on is 1,000 times worse than Gaddafi. Because at least with Gaddafi, when change finally did come, the hospitals, the schools, the secular society would have all been there safe and sound. What we have now is the biggest problem is that the secular school system, because there's so many Islamist militias in it, Libya, is being replaced with a religious school system that is trying to brainwash country of secular people who do not want to be ruled over by Islamists, trying to radicalize their children. This is the seed that could really screw up Libya, because the Libyans do not like Islamists. When they voted 80% against the Islamists in the first election, even though the socialists were banned from running. So when Hillary Clinton claims that there was an election that was fair, she should bear in mind that the entire previous government was banned. She should at least note that. That is not a free and fair election. It's a election with an asterisk after it. Just as if we banned a political party here in the United States from participating, we would get skewed results. But nonetheless, the Islamists lost terribly. Now, according to Mr. Mabrouk Derbash, Clinton actually ordered the Libyans to change the results from 80-20 to 50-50. This is because the Islamists refused to participate and they had all the guns. That would be the defense for her statement. But Dr. Mabrouk Derbash doesn't view it that way. He is stunned that Clinton would require that Libya increase the number of extremists represented in their government. Series on the Libya event at the British Parliament back in January of 2015 illustrates there were a bunch of propagandist lies launched about Libya in the beginning. One of them was that there had been Viagra rape of thousands of women. And these lies all came out very quickly. They came out from a group in Switzerland. And believe me, there was a large apparatus of forces, which I'm going to show to you shortly, that were ready to do Operation Chaos. So a number of these, another one was the fact that they claimed that Gaddafi was going to wipe everybody out in Benghazi, which is not what he said. What he said is that he was going to wipe out the jihadists in Benghazi, which he referred to as rats. And what he meant by that was the religious extremist fighters. His words were full of reconciliation with the people of Benghazi. But be that as it may, a decision was made to introduce a no-fly zone to prevent a so-called massacre from taking place in Benghazi. But instead of a hypothetical massacre taking place, it wasn't that all credible, real analysts who look at the situation would say there was never any serious chance of any massacre in Benghazi because no massacre had occurred up to then, and the Libyan government reoccupied several areas where rebellion had broken out in several cities. This wasn't the first city they went through. This no-fly resolution included a section to prevent the harming of civilians. So all of us who watched this, many of us supported the initial revolution, and it was time for a change. And then we all opposed it once NATO started bombing. Not just those of us on the outside that were intelligent people following it closely, but also the Libyans themselves went from supporting the revolution. The largest tribe, the Warfala, supported the outbreak of the revolution, but as soon as NATO started to kill the Libyan army, everyone turned the whole thing around, and they ended up on the same side as Gaddafi, opposing a foreign invasion, because Libya had been occupied from 1911 until the end of the Second World War by a horrific occupation by the Italians that included a genocide. So the largest tribe flipped over to Gaddafi once NATO started to smash the armed forces of Libya, and Gaddafi went from being somebody on his way out to becoming a national hero. This was Clinton's biggest error. Based on the emails that she was congratulated by Anne-Marie Slaughter for having turned the president around on Libya. So any intelligent analyst will say without Clinton, Libya would not have been in the shape it is in today. Because even with the U.S.'s help, it took 6 months to destroy the Gaddafi resistance, and that's because the people sided with Gaddafi in large measure. There were tribes pro-NATO and tribes against, but the people backed him up. That's why it took 6 months. This is the view of Dr. Mabrouk Darbash. Distinction. All of us observers thought that what was going to happen is everybody was going to sort of stand down until the African Union negotiated a peaceful transition between the opposition and the government. The Gaddafi or Jamahiriya or Green Libya forces were busily on the phone with all their former friends in Europe trying to figure out what was going on. But instead, NATO started to bomb things that weren't attacking civilians at the present moment. Because, to make it clear, there was very little attack of civilians by the Libyan army. The number is under 400 as far as I can tell. That might be as little as 100. This is a country that's having active rebellion breaking out. So the mistake was to attack sitting troops in camp at rest. This was a war crime. That's mistake one. Mistake two is helping the Al-Qaeda affiliated and allied forces to get weapons into Libya through Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Turkey and Qatar are Muslim Brotherhood oriented. They backed up the city-state of Misrata, so Misrata is basically Muslim Brotherhood city. And was our second big mistake, was supporting basically Al-Qaeda types because they were the only ones militarily capable of, on the ground, of overthrowing Gaddafi, and only in concert with 7 months of the largest military in the world pounding it on a daily basis. The only contracts that the government is currently funding, because according to Dr. Mabrouk Darbash, the people in the post-2011 revolutionary government, such as it is, do not want to show any progress by Gaddafi, so they didn't fund any of the projects that had been in development and stalled out all over the country, so they could claim that the Gaddafi government had delivered nothing. The only projects that they would fund were prisons. And there were about 150 Islamists in prison in Gaddafi's time. There's now 15,000 pro-Gaddafi people at minimum, according to international human rights organizations. 1/3 of the population of the country has fled the country, and the United Nations is not willing to issue them refugee status for political reasons. And I'm not making this up. This is what Dr. Darbash asserts. And this is, as I said, I would bet that he's the most credible guy I've seen to date, with a very strong knowledge of the situation. We all know that these 1 to 2 million Libyans have fled, 1/3 of their population. What I didn't know was that the UN was refusing to give them refugee status. I knew it was very strange when I went to Wikipedia. The UN would show 35,000 people, and the Tunisian prime minister was saying he had 1.5 million Libyans in his country alone. The Egyptians had 1 million, and there's 1 million in Europe. So it's out of control. Nobody mentions the fact that the largest archaeological treasure in the history of the world was looted during all of this time. But what has that got to do with whether Clinton's fit to be president or not? To understand that, you need to listen to this 22-minute piece Dr. Mabrouk Derbash laid out in 2015, January. And you also need to listen to one other piece, if I can find it for you, the Libya debacle right here. The World Today with Tariq Ali. I'll put these two links in the I will put these two links in the notes section, and also make a second part of this where I boil them down to just the sound clips that really make the indictment. So it is my view the mass of 50,000 Libyan soldiers were killed, according to Mabrouk. My own figures, I thought it was closer to 20,000. So that number is higher than what I had. But remember, Libya was a country with a population of New York City. So there's nothing in the conduct of Libya that doesn't indicate a single right decision on the part of Clinton in particular. Obama also takes responsibility because he allowed Clinton's coterie, people like Anne-Marie Slaughter, people like Susan Rice. Here she is, Samantha Power. So Obama's kept these people that are responsible for these awful acts in his government. So he takes some of the blame, to put it mildly. After all, the buck does stop there. But Anne-Marie Slaughter, there's an email that shows she congratulated Clinton on turning Obama on the issue of military intervention. And the military intervention, instead of facilitating a diplomatic agreement that would have kept the country's social achievements and social structure intact, we pressed for a military solution, liquidated their armed forces, have essentially facilitated an al-Qaeda state to be built in the western part of that country, as well as an Islamic state lit being in the center and in parts of the eastern part of the country. The old budget of Libya for civil servants was $7 billion a year. They have to pay off all these militias. The new payroll for civil servants is $29 billion a year. That's basically $22 billion a year is graft to al-Qaeda types to receive salaries. And the U.S. and Britain is apparently fine with all this. Another great fact is that the UK ambassador to Kuwait that was assigned to Libya, the UK ambassador to Kuwait had gotten involved in a sex scandal, and instead of being sacked, he was transferred to Libya, where he has no contact with the activist community and spends all of his time interacting with militias. Obviously, in Libya, these militias need to have the payments stopped, their arms collected, and the normal police and military take over. And this needs to be done through the democratic activist opposition. As I said, these are the two key pieces I would like you folks to take a look at before you pull a ballot for Hillary Clinton. And Bernie Sanders has been soft-spoken about it, but he has said clearly that he would have been much more patient. That's exactly what was required, not blowing away their troops while they're sitting in barracks, because this was the beginning of a terrible tragedy, the destruction of a culture, a civilization, infrastructure, destabilizing all of Africa, setting off consequences all over the world, with a funnel of jihadists going from Iraq via Syria and Turkey into Libya and back, funded by Qatar, that's for darn sure, and likely Kuwait. And so we have these Wahhabi axis with the Saudis, which are funding al-Qaeda and funding Islamic State, although at the same time working with the United States and bombing the Islamic State and al-Qaeda potentially. Saudi Arabia is on both sides of this because it's the mother of it as well as terrified of it. And, you know, there's every person's different. So the Saud family is of thousands of people. Some of them are funding Islamic State. Some of them are funding al-Qaeda. Some of them are actively trying to stop Islamic State and al-Qaeda. Clinton tolerated a coup, a right-wing fascist coup in South America, in Honduras, under her administration, and she has proposed similar deviltry for Syria as she had in Libya with her proposal of a no-fly zone, setting up precisely the same scenario for a failed state. Everywhere we've gone now are full of terrorists, because terrorists can only operate in failed states. Iraq was failed by us, obviously. Libya was failed by us, obviously. In the case of Syria, Syria was failed by the countries that are allied with us in conjunction with us, Saudi Arabia and Turkey in particular. So I'll compact the shocking statements you'll hear from this gentleman, Dr. Mabruk Derbash, and put that in part 2. But you can simply watch these programs yourself directly. My name is Alexander Hagan. I ask for your vote in support of Bernie Sanders and ask you to think 300 times before you pull the lever for Hillary Clinton. Thank you, good night, and good luck.